Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today's video, do not draft running backs. You guys really enjoyed yesterday's video with the wide receivers. If you haven't had the chance to go check that out, please do. But I got 3 guys for you today. One of these guys is going in the first round of your fantasy drafts. I have 2 others that are going right around, I think, in the 5 and the 6, or maybe a little bit. I think the latest guy we have here is in the 6th round. So, be sure to pay attention to these guys. And as well, much like the wide receivers, these aren't players that I would never draft. I'm still willing to draft these guys, but where their current ADP is, I just don't see much value and I don't see a lot of upside. But of course, I do think these guys will not be able to meet their ADP. So ultimately, I probably won't have many shares of these players. If you guys enjoyed today's video, be sure to drop a like. Would really, really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel as well. We're almost at 30,000 subscribers here on the OwnersBox YouTube channel. And as well, comment down below with any questions you guys have on these players, other players. I think later this week in our video dropping on Friday, we'll answer some of your questions in the comments, but wanted to kind of leave a little bit longer here from when I'm recording to be able to get some of your questions there. So we'll get to those in the video later this week. Let's get to our first back. First up here is Cam Akers. He's currently the running back 21 going in the 6th round. Last season, he finished as the RB 30, and he came off what was a massive finish to the fantasy season. If you managed to have Cam Akers on your team, because I remember there was a time when he was probably available on your waiver wire. If you had him and played him in the final 2 weeks of the final few weeks of the season, he might have helped you win a fantasy championship because he was the RB4 in fantasy points per game in the final 5 weeks, weeks 14 to 18. So for some of you, he wouldn't really have been valuable for week 18, but in weeks 14 to 17 was still very, very good. But I think when you look at how Akers' season finished last year, and how you evaluate him going into 2023, I think they're two very different things. You look at the performances in those final 5 weeks, and then I look at the teams, and I'm like, well, was this a guy who benefited from being very, very good, or did he benefit from having a very nice schedule, and of course in a situation with the Rams where offensively they didn't have anyone else to rely on but the ground game. That's the best way to take care of the football, keep yourself competitive, is keep the ball on the ground and take care of the ball. Asking Baker Mayfield to make plays to guys like Ben Skronik, Van Jefferson, and Tyler Higbee is probably not going to be very successful. So I look at those games and how those teams ranked in rushing DVOA last year. He went Las Vegas 23rd, Green Bay 31st. They were almost dead last. Denver 20th in a game they won 51-14. Denver was completely checked out. Then the Chargers, who are just notoriously one of the worst run defenses in the league, they were 29th. And finally Seattle, who was 25th. So these were fantastic matchups. I don't care what your name is, what back you were going to have success against these teams. They're very bad against the run. So to me, I think that's being overlooked, and it tends to be one that gets overlooked in the preseason when you're evaluating players going into the full year. You don't look at matchups. You just look at what the projection looks like in terms of, wow, this guy was great to end the year. He could maybe follow that up into another big year. But quite frankly, Cam Akers wasn't good last year. He wasn't an efficient back. He hasn't been for a couple of years now. Look at some of these numbers. He ranked 38th in yards per carry, 4.2 yards. He was 39th in yards after contact per attempt. His breakaway run rate of 4.3% was 32nd at the position, and then his yards created, which kind of takes away the offensive line, was 36th. This isn't a guy creating a lot of yards and a lot of fantasy points for you on his own. Like he needs a lot of help here, and that help came in the form of positive matchups. Now, the offensive line is still going to be a problem. I think it'll still be a bottom 5 unit in the NFL going into the season. They made a couple of changes, a couple of picks they added from TCU as well that can help them, but I don't think moves them into being even a middle of the road group in the league. So that's a problem in and of itself. Then they get Matthew Stafford back. And this is where things stick out for me, is Cam Akers was the running back 75. Cam Akers was the running back 75 with Matthew Stafford at quarterback from weeks 1 to 11. Now, there's a lot of factors that went into that finish, but ultimately, Cam Akers is worse off when this team has a quality quarterback in Matthew Stafford at the helm, and of course having Cooper Kupp as well, because this is a better option for Matthew Stafford to get the ball to. Cam Akers isn't a guy getting a lot of receptions or receiving volume. He's never posted 20-plus targets in his entire career. And quite frankly, this is a Rams team projected at 6.5 wins from Vegas here at DraftKings. And I think that means we're not going to see a lot of positive game scripts, much like last season. And instead of having poor quarterback play, they've got a quarterback they can trust that's won a Super Bowl that they can rely on to kind of carry them in those games, especially when things are in those game scripts where they're expected to pass the ball. They'll actually be doing that with Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp on the field. So I think Akers is more in that RB3 range because of his lack of efficiency and having no profile of being a receiving back. I think Kyron Williams steps into that role. that I'm not willing to draft him at this ADP. I think there's just no value here to be had, and he is not a guy you want to be sitting in that RB2 spot for your fantasy team. So I'm definitely avoiding him. Now for our second back, I decided I'm going to save our first round back that I'm avoiding for my last guy here. This one is still going very, very, very early. Jamir Gibbs. He's currently the RB15. He's going in the end of the third round. Obviously, the rookie comes in here after the team spent significant draft capital to add him, and a lot of people will look to that draft capital and say, well, look at these past guys, your Leonard Fournettes, your Saquon Barkley. These guys were very successful early on in their careers, and that draft capital has something to do with it. Certainly think Jamir Gibbs is a player that the Lions will be using plenty, but the profile here is not one that suits where his draft capital currently sits at. And this is a guy I talked about probably a month ago now, but I really feel it's necessary to bring him back up for those of you that didn't watch that video. For Gibbs, the profile, again, or in this offense, the value comes from scoring touchdowns. We saw it with Jamal Williams. Now, there's still an opportunity here. This was a Lions team. I think they were like almost just above average in terms of running back targets on the season. But when we look at the touchdowns, look at Jamir Gibbs, not all, looking at college stats and college numbers and college, a player's college role doesn't always predict what they're going to be like in the NFL. I've seen plenty of backs that didn't have a receiving profile in college find one in the NFL. But for Gibbs, I think that what he was doing in college is very predictive of what we're going to see at the NFL level. So just looking at my numbers here, I want to make sure I get these right. He had just a 21% share of inside the 5 carries in 2022, which was his only season at Alabama. So he led the team in opportunities. But once the ball got inside the 5, got into those scoring areas, he was not getting the football. And that isn't just at Alabama. He was at Georgia Tech for his 2 years prior. And Georgia Tech was one of the worst teams, the worst team in the ACC, I would say, and one of the worst teams in Power 5. He still didn't lead their team in inside the 5 carries. A terrible football team. He still didn't lead the team in inside the 5 carries. They still went to somebody else for those looks. And he's never scored up until his last season in Alabama. The first time he had found the end zone double-digit times. And there's a lot of college backs who have found the end zone double-digit times. Like Saquon Barkley, he's finding the end zone double-digit times. Leonard Fournette, he's finding the end zone double-digit times. This is not the profile that Gibbs has. He's a terrific pass catcher. He can be explosive and create big plays. But you know who else can do that? DeAndre Swift, and he finished as the running back 22 last year. That is more where I see Gibbs, that more firmly in the RB2 category, not on the precipice of being an RB1 and potentially being drafted as an RB1 once we get closer to the start of the fantasy season. So when you're a top 15 back, you need to have at least one of two things, double-digit touchdowns or 270 plus touches. The only exception to that in the last, I think I looked at the last 10 years, I believe. The only guy who was the exception to that was Mike Davis in 2020, but it was because in his fantasy finish, there was like a massive drop-off from the top tier guys, the top 3, to the rest of the field. So one that I don't think is really kind of that outlier in the data here. The other thing I think about when I think about this offense, it's not like they don't have any other option than to get the ball to Jamir Gibbs in those areas. David Montgomery can earn receptions and potentially eat into his reception total, but he profiles as the better short yardage guy. He's had those opportunities in his career with Chicago, and he's also top 10 amongst running backs last year in broken tackles per carry, stuff rate, and hit at the line rate. So he's a good guy in terms of being able to avoid negative yardage, convert those short yardage opportunities. So again, I look at where he's being drafted and I see Joe Mixon and Aaron Jones going right behind him, 2 guys that I think have very little competition for their volume. And I say I would much rather have those guys because I see the upside. If I'm taking a top 15 back, I want to have a realistic shot at them being able to be a top 5 back. And I don't quite see that for Gibbs. So I'm looking to avoid him for as long as he's going as a top 15 back in fantasy. And finally, the running back going in the first round of your fantasy football drafts that I really think you should be avoiding this year is Saquon Barkley. He's going right now as the running back 3. The RB3 on the season, going at the tail end of the first round. The 110 spot is where I have him right now. He was the RB6 in 2022, and now he's being projected to finish a few spots even better than that. And look, I have some problems with, I think, what Saquon's talent is at right now, which we'll get into in a little bit. You can't doubt the opportunity. A lot of this for me comes down to the schedule. Something that, like I mentioned earlier, when you listen to a fantasy analyst or read fantasy content, a lot of people will talk about that person's role in the offense and projecting their volume and opportunity, but they won't take into account schedule. Meanwhile, during the season, like I was making videos last year in the tail half of the season saying, here are the running backs with the best schedule the rest of the way that are going to help you win your leagues. You don't see that happening in the preseason, but it is something you need to take into account because we value it so much during the season. And I looked at Saquon's schedule, and this is the problem when you go from being a team that was really poor in 2021 to then making the playoffs and having a great season in 2022. Unfortunately, with how the schedule works, you're punished for that. Like, you get a tougher schedule, and 6 of the first 8 games are against teams that finished top 10 in rush DVOA last season. That's one of my favorite metrics to use during the season when I'm looking at matchups for running backs is how difficult is this? I'll look at that number. But not only that, these teams were also all in the top 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So only 5 of the teams that he plays in the entire season this year weren't in the top 15 in fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. Now, these numbers and these teams in these top 15 is of course going to change. It's predictive, but it's not exactly a science here of these teams will be the same next year. But let me just look at a few teams and the 6 teams I mentioned of those first 8 games. These teams I think are still going to be very good against the run. The Cowboys, who I think have just gotten better defensively. If you watch my top 10 defenses video, they're my number 1 defense in the league this season. The 49ers, who I don't think will take much of a step back at all against the run. They have a terrific front. And then the Dolphins, who've consistently had a great front 7. The Bills, the Commanders, they have the best front 4 in the NFL, in my opinion. And then the Jets. These are all really tough teams to run the ball against. So I do not think Saquon has a great start to his season. If you still believe in him and his talent, you might be better off buying low on him later in the season, but I'm not drafting him at this ADP. The volume, of course, like I mentioned, is there though. 4th in rush attempts with 295, hit 57 receptions, which was 7th. But here's the thing, the opportunity is there, but this isn't the same explosive back we saw when he was drafted into the league by the Giants out of Penn State. He's not nearly as efficient with his opportunities. He was 39th in yards after contact per attempt. He was 21st in breakaway run rate. He just doesn't, he'll create a number of explosive plays because he gets so many opportunities, but he doesn't do it at a consistent basis. His true yards per carry was just 4.1 yards, which was 35th at the position. I think Saquon Barkley is still going to get plenty of opportunities. He's not going to completely bust unless we see another injury like we've seen in years past, but I definitely wouldn't be predicting injury for him. I think the schedule is really tough. We add Darren Waller to bring in a little bit more competition for those receiving opportunities. And I do think that this is a spot with Saquon that I just don't realistically see him meeting. And if I'm drafting him in the first round, I have to be able to see a top 3 finish. And I do not see a top 3 finish for him, even though that's exactly where his ADP is at. So I'm definitely looking to avoid Barkley and looking at a Bijan Robinson for sure over him at the running back position. All right, those are my 3 do not draft running backs for the 2023 fantasy season. If you guys enjoy the video, be sure to let me know. Like I said off the top, would love if you could sub to the channel, help us get to 30,000 subscribers. We're going to have a little bit of an uplift in fantasy content, a little bit more videos now with training camp getting going. We'll be sharing in a video this week of some of the most exciting storylines that you need to pay attention to as it pertains to fantasy. There's tons of stuff to look for, so we'll be dropping that later this week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next one.